I'm going to tell you about targeting the medial prefrontal cortex, new data on targeting this area for alcohol addiction with some recent publications on the measurements that we did with EEG and DTI to start to understand the mechanisms of brain stimulation, but some background before. In the case of alcohol addiction, just like many other drugs, there are many treatment programs that are quite successful and get people to stop taking the drug. The problem is how long they preserve, without using the drug. And we see here that even with alcohol, where there are many very advanced programs, more than 50% within a year will relapse. So you can go for a very well, established treatment program with pharmacological interventions, psychological interventions, and everything. But eventually, these are the statistics in big studies. In all drugs, the problem is relapse, and within a year, more than 50% would relapse. So the concept of using brain stimulation as a treatment for addiction, we started it actually many years ago. We were, I think, the first ones who really evaluate this directly in rats. And this is a paper we published on cocaine addiction in a rat model, where we measured some glutamatergic alterations in the brain following brain stimulation, multiple sessions of stimulation, either in the lateral hypothalamus or the prefrontal cortex. We wanted to stimulate the reward system, or either the fibers of passage, where you get brain stimulation reward in the lateral hypothalamus or the prefrontal cortex. And behaviorally and also neurochemically, we will not get into the details of this old study, we found that it really matters where you stimulate and how you stimulate. Just as an example, if you look at the stimulation at the lateral hypothalamus and you take the very well-established behavioral sensitization paradigm, where you look at how much cocaine injection will induce motor activation, okay? So following the repeated stimulation sessions, you get sensitization of the effect for cocaine. So the injection of cocaine actually induced greater motor activation following the treatment of, say, 10 days of stimulation in a TMS-like pattern. I will get into the patterns later. But in the case of prefrontal cortex stimulation, if we implant the electrode for stimulation in the prefrontal cortex, you get desensitization. That means that the response to cocaine injection will actually be reduced in terms of simply the motor activation following the injection. Or when we use the self-administration model, you can see that both in the case of lateral hypothalamus electrode or prefrontal cortex electrode, and here are some parameters. High frequencies stimulation can be 10 hertz, or more than 1 hertz would be considered high frequency, but usually use 10 or 20 hertz of trains, and you train them for 15 minutes a day or half hour a day. This is how you do TMS in humans. You give, say, 100 trains over half hour, and you give it for several weeks. And in this case, it was 10 sessions in 2 weeks. And you see that there is a reduction in the active group versus the sham group where the electrode is implanted, but stimulation current is 0. And you get reduction in their drug-seeking behavior. Drug-seeking behavior after the rats are trained, they self-administer cocaine, and now you test them just how many times they press the lever to seek for the cocaine without cocaine in the syringe. And so for both cases, we see a reduction in the drug-seeking behavior, but when we measure the motivation to consume the cocaine, so we put the cocaine back into the syringe, but then the number of times they have to press the lever in order to receive the next cocaine injection increases from one trial to another. So if they first have to press the lever 1 time for a single cocaine injection, then they have to press for 2 times, and then for 5 times, and then up to 200 times until they're pissed off. And we measure how much they're motivated to take the cocaine. And you see here that, again, with the lateral hypothalamus, there is some sensitization, not significant, but in the prefrontal cortex, again, there is a reduction in their motivation to consume cocaine. Okay, so this was early studies which also indicated, and I cannot really get into all the details in the introduction, that the cues associated with the drug are important. When you stimulate the brain, you stimulate an area, you want to stimulate the specific circuitry associated with the behavior. So we know that in memory research, that items that are stored in long-term memory become prone to change upon their retrieval. You want to, if you want to change craving, for example, you want to induce the craving, you want to activate the circuitry associated with the craving, and then stimulate the brain and change it. Okay? You can change the memory this way. We had a study in a conditioned aversive taste aversion. It's like a model for PTSD in rats. And there, only when the stimulation came after retrieval of the memory, we were able to change the memory. And then when we translated this to a human study in PTSD patients, so here we gave TMS, using the same type of patterns of stimulation as we did in the rats. And in PTSD patients, we had a script in their ears that recall, retrieve the traumatic memory, and then we provide the stimulation. So every day, this half hour of treatment, we're proceeded first with the recall of the trauma for 1 minute, and then the stimulation came up. And clinically, after 4 weeks of treatment, only the group that really received this cue, this retrieval of the memory, showed reduction in symptoms. The CAPS is the measurements of the clinical symptoms of PTSD. So it was in the reduced, this is the active, this is the sham control. But when we just gave the stimulation without the retrieval of the memory, there was no effect. Or when we gave just the retrieval of the memory without the stimulation, with sham stimulation, also no effect. So only the combination between the recall of the memory and the stimulation produced the effect. Now, in addiction, we tried to show the same concept as well. We were not very successful, but I will show you what we did find first in smoking and then in more recent studies in alcohol. So where should we stimulate? First, we learned from the rest that prefrontal cortex is a good region. We also know when looking at cue-induced craving, if we take many studies, a review of many studies, we can understand that the insula and the medial prefrontal and anterior cingulate cortex are always activated in response to drug-associated cues of different types. So these are the regions that we want to affect. First, when we did a study, more easy in smoking, easier to recruit smokers first, we first actually did a study in superficial TMS, which didn't show much effect, and we went with deep TMS to target the insula. And maybe some of you know about this very famous science paper showing that stroke patients that had lesions in the insula stopped smoking, but not in other regions. So we targeted the lateral prefrontal cortex and insula. It is not really possible to, like in the rats, to implant an electrode and get a very specific area. So we stimulate whatever is on the way. When you do deep TMS, you always stimulate also the superficial areas around it. So it was lateral prefrontal cortex and insula stimulated. And we found here we tested for effect of 1 Hertz stimulation versus 10 Hertz, 13 sessions of treatment. Each treatment is 20 minutes with 100 sessions, with like 3,000 pulses altogether. And you see the reduction in the number of cigarettes, especially the red here is the 10 Hertz in the 10 Hertz case. In the 1 Hertz, it wasn't very effective. And also we measured cotinine in the urine, not just to be based on the report of how much they smoke, but also to have some objective measure. Cotinine is the derivative of nicotine. And so you see that even if the 1 Hertz without the cues showed some reduction, it didn't really show in the objective measures of the cotinine. But the 10 Hertz plus the cue had the best effect. Okay, so from here we went on for a multi-center study, a very big study that involved like more than 20 centers in the world. And we recruited heavy smokers that had many previous failed attempts to stop smoking. So we're talking about smokers that are very stubborn. This is the number of years they smoke in average in the study in the active or the sham group. You see the number of cigarettes per day in average, although we also had some patients taking 3 packs per day. And the most important issue is that they all failed prior quitting attempts. Close to 70% of them failed 3 different attempts. When I say attempts, it includes drugs, CBT, smokers. We were able to replicate this original study using high-frequency stimulation plus the cues. You see the active versus the sham group, intention to treat cohort, or completers, those who received, who were completers in the treatment. In all cases, the sham treatment. And when you look at the short-term follow-up, which is after 1 month, and even 3 months later, you see this big difference between active and sham, and this led to FDA approval of deep TMS for treating addiction. However, when you really look at the numbers, you see very low, success rate. So yes, it's better than sham, but look how poor is the sham group, and how poor also is the active group. It's just much more, it's 3 times better, but still, the effect in this type of very heavy smokers is not very great. But still, this is FDA approved, and the treatment is being delivered worldwide, particularly in the United States. Interestingly, when looking at the data of this study, specifically this cue-induced effect, so you see here what happens, for example, in the first session of stimulation. So we have visual analog scale where patients report how much they want a cigarette right now, between 1 and 10, okay? And then you present the video, and they smell the cigarette, and you do this provocation for 4 minutes, and you measure again how much they want a cigarette right now. So of course, there is an increase in their craving, altogether in 0.5 point. It's not much, from 1 to 10. And the average increase in their cue-induced craving, right, is just very little. And then when we measure the craving following the session, after half hour of treatment with the TMS, you see, of course, a reduction in their craving. This is the VAS3 minus 2. 3 is after the TMS, 2 is after the cue-induced craving. But this is the really important measure. If you measure VAS3 minus VAS1, that means how much they crave now after the TMS relative to baseline before they had the cues. This is showing you that with the active treatment, there is a reduction in their craving. So the TMS was able, in average, acutely, a single session, to reduce their craving. The interesting finding here, other than the fact that from day to day craving was reduced both in the active and the sham group, is that this effect in the first session could predict who is going to quit eventually after 4 months. When we measured them in 1 month and 4 months later, we have the definition of a quitter where you measure it in their urine and their self-report. So a quitter was a person who really had responded already in the first session in terms of the cue-induced craving. So the craving was reduced, again, in the active but not in the sham group, but those who had greater reduction in their craving acutely due to the TMS session were those who actually eventually, could quit. Fine. So now, from this is the history of addiction treatment with brain stimulation, and now to a more recent studies with alcohol. So Where do we want to target in the brain to treat alcohol addiction? I will tell you now that there is right now an ongoing, about to start. It's already to start a big multi-center study to replicate the results that I'm going to show you today. Now, the target originally was either the anterior cingulate or the insula. So we had two different studies that were published already, and basically I can tell you that the insula target did not work in terms of relative active versus sham, but the medial prefrontal cortex and anterior cingulate target did work, and there is a lot of course, evidence for involvement of the anterior cingulate and the medial prefrontal cortex in the neuropathology of alcohol addiction. So the study, here you see the system, how it looks like. This is the helmet, which encases a coil, the active coil and the sham coil. The sham coil is what you see here. This is the active coil, and the sham coil produces acoustic artifact and some vibration of the scalp, but the active coil actually penetrates into the brain. What you see here in red pixels is where the electric field induced by the pulse is more than 100 volts per meter. 100 volts per meter is what you need in order to, for example, activate your hand. If you put the coil over the hand motor area and I give you a pulse, your hand will jump. You need about 100 volts per meter to get, activation, motor activation. So here you can get the map based on phantom brain measures with the active coil versus the sham coil. You see that the stimulation is very widely spread in coronal slices. And the comparison, or the subject doesn't really know whether he receives an active or a sham treatment. There is a card reader here. Each patient gets a card with a number, and obviously the operator might be able to distinguish some responses, but in many cases even the operator of the system doesn't know, and also the person who makes the evaluations, the clinical evaluations, doesn't really know whether the subject received active or sham treatment. The same system that we had in the addiction study, in the smoking cessation study. In this study, we also had brain imaging before and after the 15 stimulation sessions. 15 stimulation sessions, that means 3 weeks. We have one per day, 5 days a week. So 3 weeks of treatment. Each time they get about 3,000 pulses. 10 hertz, we learned this already from rats and from the nicotine study. And then the most important part, as I started my lecture, is about the follow-up. How much does it last? How much can you really keep them without drinking? In this study, the criteria was to be an alcohol use disorder patient that is able to stop at least for a week, because we were concerned about seizures. The stimulation can cause seizures. While you're in withdrawal, you can get a seizure. So they had to stop for a week and then start getting the 3 weeks of the treatment. So they stopped drinking, and then they get 3 weeks of treatment. We did imaging before and after the 3 weeks, and then follow them up for 3 months. And again, the cues came. Each patient had a favorite drink. So we poured the favorite drink into a glass. We give it to the subject. He smells it. He's not allowed to drink it. And he sees it. It's on the table in front of him for the whole session, half hour, every day, 3 weeks. Very hard, very inducing. And you get it both in the active and in the sham group. This was so this is the schedule, 3 weeks of treatment, then follow-up measures after a week, 2 weeks, 4 weeks, 8 weeks, and 3 months follow-up. Eventually, we had, in this feasibility study, 23 who got to the end of treatment, and then this is the 3 months of follow-up. As I said, we have MRI before and after the treatment. As you see here, we're talking about quite heavy drinkers. 30% of the time they drink. Like that means at least 2 binge. I mean, when I say drinking, maybe I didn't explain that. Drinking, it's important that there is a definition for how much is a binge. Okay, it's like 4 glasses of beer for a woman and 5 for a man. Okay, yeah. And and this is the craving measures. Okay, heavy drinkers. What we found here is that, yes, they are able to stop. Otherwise, they are not entered into the study. You see both the active and the sham really reduce their heavy drinking. The percentage of days that they drink, that they binge, is very low after we start the treatment. The problem is how much they keep it. And again, you see with the sham group, there is a gradual increase in their heavy drinking days. And in the sham group, it's lower, and this is significant. And here you see the amount of alcohol consumed, grams per week over the weeks, over the 12 weeks. Again, the active group is better than the sham. And also here we have an objective measures in the urine. We have this measurement of alcohol metabolites in the urine. Also, you see the difference between the active and the sham. And when you look at the craving, again, the craving is reduced even in the sham, but even within these 3 weeks of treatment, it continues to reduce, but doesn't change in the sham group. And then for the additional 3 months, you see a gradual increase in craving as measured by the PAX scale, and quite stable in the low in the active group. Looking at the brains, so we had 2 seeds were of interest because the coil stimulates the medial prefrontal cortex and anterior cingulate. And when you look whole brain analysis, we found that the connectivity, the functional connectivity at rest between medial prefrontal cortex and the subgenual anterior cingulate cortex is reduced following the 3 weeks of treatment in the active group, while there is a tendency for an increase in the sham group. Remember, this is during withdrawal. They are not allowed to drink during these 3 weeks. And also between the anterior cingulate cortex and the cardiac, there is a reduction in connectivity, as you see here. So these are the neurobiological correlates of the effect, but they were not directly correlated with the magnitude of the clinical outcome or the craving. A later study, we analyzed the DTI, fractional anisotropy, is known actually to be reduced during acute withdrawal. So what you see here is that first comparing healthy and alcoholic patients, you see that there is reduction in fractional anisotropy, which indicates loss of connectivity between regions. So you see it everywhere in most parts of the brain. And also comparing short versus long abstinence, both in human studies and in rat studies, you see this reduction in fractional anisotropy, which indicates reduction in connectivity between regions. And we also know that white matter alterations progress during early abstinence is suggested to contribute to the relapse vulnerability. And in our cohort, when we measure the DTI, we see that altogether now, without separating active and sham, altogether during these 3 weeks, if we compare the DTI outcomes, fractional anisotropy was reduced. So we do see also in our sample this reduction in connectivity following treatment. However, when we look at the area of the stimulation, which is prefrontal cortex, right, and anterior cingulate, we find that this compromise, this reduction in connectivity is actually halted by the active treatment, but not in the sham treatment. You see here, this is in this area of the stimulation, we get some significant difference between active and sham treatment. And then when you reconstruct the axonal tracks of the white matter regions showing the preserved fractional anisotropy values, and then you can have additional statistical analysis for the relevant regions. And here we found actually that the connectivity between dorsomedial prefrontal cortex and temporoparietal gyrus is actually increased in the active versus the sham. This is before and after, active versus sham. And also that there is an increase in negative functional connectivity in the active group between the middle prefrontal gyrus and the precuneus. So following these DTI measures, and when we go back to the functional connectivity measures in the earlier study, we find additional, neurobiological correlates of the differences between active and sham. Finally, and this is the most recent publication that came out of this study, we look at the EEG outcomes. And here maybe I should just say one word because we don't have much time to dive into it. There is a lot of literature about beta activity in alcoholics. Okay, we know that there is some alterations in beta activity, prefrontal beta activity in alcoholics. And when you compare the active versus the sham, real active versus sham, you see that the beta before and after 3 weeks of treatment is increased in the active and decreased in the sham. So again, we get we get a halted reduction in the beta as we had halted reduction in connectivity. Also prefrontal beta activity reduction during the 3 weeks of withdrawal was halted by the multiple sessions of stimulation during these 3 weeks. Okay. Moreover, and we are going to end with this, we can predict who is going to remain sober and who is going to relapse based on this beta activity. So you see in the active group, those who had baseline activity of high beta were those who did not relapse. And in the sham group, you don't see this correlation. So high activity of beta at baseline predicted the ability to avoid relapse. And even looking at the TMS-induced beta activity, this is the TMS-induced beta activity. Again, in the active group, you see a correlation between the TMS-induced beta activation and the ability to remain sober. So non-relapse are those who had more activation of beta already in the first session. So the ability of TMS to activate the beta, to keep it high, was associated with the ability to not to relapse or to remain sober. Conclusions. So here we present a therapeutic potential of deep TMS targeting the medial prefrontal and anterior cingulate cortex for addiction, particularly alcohol addiction. Deep TMS was able to halt the progression of white matter changes during early abstinence under the stimulation area, and also to halt the progression of frontal beta power changes. We didn't really dive into it, but the sham group shows this reduction in beta power, but DTMS halts this progression. The clinical outcome also may be predicted by the beta power at baseline. And I think that right now that when we are doing the multi-center, hopefully to confirm the findings that we had in the feasibility study, as we were able to do in the smoking study, this might become as a novel approach to treat alcohol addiction. And of course, I must thank all the involved researchers in the study, which first is Marcus Heilig was involved, and Santiago helped a lot with the DTI analysis. Marianne was a PhD student at my group now, is going for her postdoc. And thank you for listening.